Welcome to the Love with Francesca podcast, where we deep dive into relationships, self-love, and the empowering journey to authentic connection and healing. Hi, Colette. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Francesca. I'm excited to be here.
Me too. So you and I just like randomly, I think, connected on Instagram. I wanted to launch this podcast several months ago. And so I reached out to you and was like, I want to do this thing. Will you be on? And then I kind of disappeared for a few months and reconnected with you this week.
Mhm.
So thank you for being super open to this and being so flexible with this whole process.
Of course. No, and I've been following you this whole time, and I love everything you do, and I'm in total support.
Thank you.
And I understand that we kind of just have to go with the flow in the way
Yeah.
that like, these things come to us. So
Yeah. And
more
we're
than
gonna
happy to wait.
thank you. And we're gonna deep dive into perfectionism, which I just found out we both are. So before we do that, why don't you tell me a little bit about you, what you do, and what kind of drew you to the work that you do now?
Yeah, so I am a licensed clinical social worker in New York. So I am a therapist and I work with people who live in New York, mostly anxious, I say anxious and perfectionistic women. And I guess I'm drawn to it because it's something that I have struggled with myself. And it's funny because I don't know that I'm like overtly anxious and that I have panic attacks or things like that, but a lot of overthinking and a lot of being overly critical and a lot of really high expectations for myself that I think over time I've kind of realized aren't always necessary and don't always get you where you need to be.
Mhm.
So I think that's how I've kind of gotten to this specific line of work that I've been in.
I love that. And I'm always curious, like, what drew you specifically? Like, what was like, when was the moment that you were like, ooh, I could actually help people for a living. I could be a therapist.
You know, I used to hate answering this question, and I get asked it all the time, and it's totally okay. It's okay that you're asking. Because when I was in social work school, we had like pretty small classes, and generally we would go around, and people would have these like beautiful, transformative experiences with like therapists and social workers and how they work through their trauma, and like
Yeah.
and literally what happened was I was a nursing major going into school. And I just decided going into my sophomore year that the thought of having to do clinical rotations in the hospital felt like gross. I guess the clinical word is like unaligned, but like it felt at the time
No,
just
no,
like,
let's be real. Like, what does it really feel like?
yeah, like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just wasn't looking forward to it. Like I
Yeah.
was like, oh, this thing I have to do. And I was like,
Hmm.
I don't think that's a good sign of
Yeah.
I should do it the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So I went to like a regular advisor in school to change my major to undecided, and he made this one-off comment of like, a lot of people who switch out of nursing switch into social work. And I was like, oh, okay. And I like truly didn't really know what a social worker was, wasn't really clear on it, as most people are not. Most
Yeah.
people they take children away in CPS, and like
Yeah.
other than
Yeah.
that, people don't know very much. So I looked into it and I kind of was like, oh, like I think like I liked the human body and I liked biology, but that didn't have to be a part of it. And it really was like the helping um an emotional support piece of it that I connected
Mm.
to.
Hmm. I love
Um
that.
and when I thought about like and I looked at all the like field placements they had, I was like, "Oh, like that looks fun." And I felt like energized by it and excited for it. And I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, this feels more right."
Yeah. Okay, wait. I actually really love your response, and I'm glad that something in me was like, this is the next question you're going to ask her, even though you created a whole list of questions, but we're going to ignore those because this is way better. I really love that you said that because not in my actual coaching business, but I also work with my dad who we run a career coaching business, and it's all about aligning your career to we don't say this like super publicly because people are weird about this word, but to your soul's mission, right? So
Mhm.
it's like a more spiritual approach to it. And it's exactly what you just described. Like simply put, you were in a profession, the idea of doing something in your body felt like
Mhm.
icky, gross, this isn't what I want to do. and you listen to that. And I really respect that and admire that because I think a lot of people actually really struggle to make decisions based off like what their body is telling them versus
Yeah.
like what they should do, especially when it comes to your career.
Yes. And I think it's very, I think what you and your dad do is so important because it is, like the feeling of when it's not aligned
Yeah.
and like if you're questioning it. And it's tough because I work with a lot of people who maybe are in college or are very unsure.
Hmm.
And again, I was a perfectionist. I did very well in school. That was never a problem. Like that was not up for debate. That was not a limiting factor. And
Yeah.
but I think when you're a perfectionist, the passion element is lost because like you said,
Yes.
it's very cognitive. It's very what should I
Yeah.
do?
Yeah.
What are the steps that I take? What is the right
Yeah.
thing to do? What does that look
Yeah.
like? And it doesn't very often come from, like you said, a soul, a spiritual, an inner
Yeah.
place.
Just like what your body is telling you that
Yes.
like you actually want to do. Yeah. And and 100%. And to add to what you were saying is that um especially for perfectionist or overthinkers, career or even love life or whatever it is, it's like you said, it's cognitive. And so we're so much more focused on like what my parents want me to do or what my
Mhm.
grandparents want me to do or like what my school teacher told me that I'd be good at. Or like you know, whatever. Yes.
Right.
And whereas what the work that you do is probably helping people actually connect a little bit more to like, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
But it's hard to figure that out when you're not used to thinking that way.
And it's very often it's not what people think about. Like when you're making a decision, right? Because
Yeah.
again, I often work with people who they're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know the right thing to do. I don't know, should I do this and that? And they're like
Yeah.
mathematically calculating like all of the equations that go into making a decision.
Yes.
And like you said, like what do I want to do is not even in there. Like that's not even
Yeah.
considered. So very often it does take just asking, okay, so you've given me the breakdown, like you've given me the pro cons. What do you want to do? And they're like,
Right.
oh, I guess. And sometimes they even answer, and sometimes, like you said, they don't know. But I think I work a lot of there's a few different modalities I pull from, but one of them
Yeah.
is called ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. And
Yeah.
it's very, there's branches to it, but it's very aligned on values and kind of identifying what your values are and kind of being guided by that. And
Yeah.
so sometimes if somebody doesn't know, and sometimes they don't, and it could go have to do with job or relationship or anything else. But even just something as simple as like giving a list of values. I've had people like cry and become
Mm.
emotional because they didn't realize that like something was really meaningful to them or that they weren't adhering to a value that was important to them in a really significant way. So
Hmm.
I tend to find that as a little bit helpful as like at least a starting point
That's
if you really
beautiful.
don't know.
Yeah, because it sounds like you're giving them permission to even think about themselves and what it is that actually, like, what they actually find meaningful
Mhm.
or important to them in their life rather
Yeah.
than prioritizing. And it's kind of similar to the work that we do. We talk a lot with people at the beginning of like, you are the priority. Your life is yours only.
Mhm.
I'm pretty young. My dad's 77 though. So he's like, listen, I know what it means to live your life and live a full life. And at the end of the day, and he's like, at a certain point, I kind of realized like I can't keep working to satisfy someone else's dreams. I have to satisfy my own. Because who wants to get to the end of their life and be like, oh, I did everything right. I did everything perfect.
Mhm.
But I actually feel, yeah, so a lot of the clients that we work with kind of come to us because they're like later on in life and they feel super empty inside because
Yeah.
they did the right things. They built the things that they were supposed to build, but it's not really giving them that satisfaction that they thought they would receive at the end of the finish line, let's say.
Right. And I think I found that too because again, I did fine in school. It wasn't a problem. And I was like, I worried so much about my grades and I went into social work. Like it didn't matter. And I
Right.
will say, and I have compassion for some people because I do work with some like lawyers or things that like the grade actually really does matter. Like getting
Yeah.
into law school, like you're fighting against first of all, that's a whole institution that like is not aligned for people's wellness in any way. But
Right,
like I
right.
do acknowledge that there are some professions where the number really matters. But I
Yeah.
think sometimes you really have to come in and be like, how much does this really matter?
Yeah. Yeah.
That like
It's
I
funny.
really crushed myself and was so worried. And like it wouldn't
Yeah.
have mattered if I had B's. It wouldn't have
Right.
mattered.
Right. That's so true. I love that you bring up law school. My sister she's a lawyer now and she was studying to be a lawyer. And I was like, Gabs, like, it's okay. You'll be okay. She's like, no, you don't understand. Like, I have to get this grade.
Yeah.
She's like, I'm
And
not just
I've
being
been
hard on
told that.
myself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because that's not my world, so I don't know,
Right.
but I have been told that enough times that I do
Right.
understand the significance.
Yeah.
But I think even in that situation, to reframe it as to have compassion for themselves, that like it is a brutal system
Yeah.
and it's an unfair system and it's not healthy for anybody. Like you're not
Right.
failing because you're miserable. Like it
Right.
is a system that is set up for people to be quite miserable. It's not your fault
Yeah.
that's happening.
Yeah, I love that kind of like taking the blame or shame like
Yeah.
off the person. So I kind of got excited and I got a little ahead of myself, but if we
Sure.
can take a step backwards and maybe just kind of define perfectionism a little bit, because as a perfectionist in recovery, it took me a long time to understand what perfectionism was and actually identify myself with it because I was far from perfect in terms of what I thought perfect was. Like I was messy,
Yeah.
I was scatterbrained, I yeah, just very disorganized. I wasn't getting like the excellent grades. I wasn't like your typical overachiever. So I didn't understand the perfectionism. So if you could walk us through like the spectrum of perfectionism, I
Yeah.
guess, if you can call it that.
Yes, and it's so true. I think I actually myself have had issues sometimes with the way that I write and explain perfectionism. How do I get people to connect to it? Because it is so different, right? And I think a lot of people don't necessarily identify with perfectionism because it's so
Hmm.
sometimes embedded in people's personality.
Hmm.
And they're
Yeah.
like, oh, this is just like what I do, and this is just
Yeah.
like who I am. And it's not
Yeah.
um, but I think first of all, perfection isn't like being perfectionistic, I guess, in a conventional sense, is just like having exceedingly high expectations for yourself. I guess it's just like the simplest way of putting it.
Hmm.
Um, but it really is more how you feel. So you could have high expectations and like, no, you know what? I had high expectations. I did my best and I feel okay that I did my best no matter the outcome. Perfectionism generally is more of feeling really down on yourself and being overly self-critical
Hmm.
about not about like missing a mark or missing the
Hmm.
mark that you
Right.
have for yourself.
Right. Because it's very deep rooted in shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like how you define that because when you were first kind of mentioning the unrealistic expectations, waiting to hear the rest of the response, but I was
Yeah.
going to kind of challenge you on that because I'm like, well, but I know a lot of people that have unrealistic expectations and they don't think that they're unrealistic. So
Mm-hmm.
they truly expect themselves to get to that level. But like you then explained, it's like, it's not just the expectations. It's like, how do you feel when you don't reach them? How do you treat
Yeah.
yourself when you don't reach them? How do you talk to yourself? And are you even aware of how you talk to yourself? Because I was not aware of
Mm-hmm.
how I talked to myself. I just had a full-blown mental illness and I would just let all my feelings, I would suppress them through that, right? And so I
Yes.
think a lot of people probably don't come into your office saying like, I'm a perfectionist with high expectations. It's more of like, yeah, like how do they show up? How do people tend to first arrive? What is like the primary complaining problem that they have?
Um, there's a few. I would say in the categories, it's feeling burdened, like feeling
Mm,
overly burdened by all
yeah,
the things they have to do. Um, feeling, I would say feeling taken advantage of. I would say people pleasing is a piece of it because often
yeah,
it comes with not wanting to let people down and being um feeling the need to be perfect in that way and having to show
yeah.
up for people more than themselves. So I would say more than anything, it's like worn out. Uh,
Yeah, that
and when
makes
I
sense.
ask people what they want, and so often they say, I just want to be happy. which is hard for me because that is a fleeting thing, right? Like, and the
Yeah.
reality
Yeah.
is you're not gonna like hit a baseline of happy and then like you're done. So it's also figuring out like what is your version of happy and what is that bounce back, right? Like when
Yeah.
things happen that bring you down or when you feel so worn out,
Yeah.
that's natural. That's going to happen sometimes. But like where,
Right. Right.
what is that barrier that's keeping you from that?
That makes a lot of sense that that's kind of like the goal that they identify though, because when you're in the peak of your perfectionism, let's say, um, and you feel so burdened, the idea of just being able to feel like content with yourself
Mhm.
feels very difficult
Yeah.
to do. It feels very like let alone celebrating yourself. That's
Yes,
like
God forbid.
impossible.
Yeah.
God forbid you praise yourself for something that you did, but even just being like, oh, okay, that was good enough. Like, even
Mhm.
that is so challenging for someone that's so perfectionistic. So, I would imagine you also see a lot of people that are probably like burning out or
Yeah.
at burnout because they're
Mhm.
probably overdoing themselves. Definitely, they feel taken advantage of because yeah, a perfectionist mostly wants to please you. So the more you give them,
Yeah.
they're like, yes, of course. And then they're like, I don't know how to manage all the things that I think I
Right. And they get lost in that.
yeah,
Like they get very lost.
of course. And then everything that you do has to be done at top quality standard
Mhm.
level. And there's just not enough hours in a day to do
Right.
that. So that's got to be really challenging.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I think it's really difficult because I like you said, not everybody identifies with perfectionistic, right? So like that
yeah,
word specifically. So it's kind of
yeah.
a challenge of like you said, you leave so many thoughts in a day and
Hmm.
identifying what are they? Like
Yeah.
what is causing me to feel burdened? What are the thoughts in my head that I'm thinking that I have to uphold? And how can I pull that apart and decide like what
Mm,
what is important to me, what is aligned with the value, and what is
yeah.
somebody else's expectation, what is an expectation of mine that I don't want to hold anymore,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of parsing it out from there.
Interesting. Yeah, so it sounds like at the beginning it's very just like let's just develop like basic awareness of our
Mhm.
thoughts and emotions.
Yeah.
And then once we're aware of those thoughts, let's parse out like which of these are we going to keep, which of these are we going to get rid of.
Yeah.
However, it is challenging, right? Because when you start working with someone that's already kind of how do I say this delicately? Not crawled themselves into a hole, but like they're in a really tough
Yeah.
kind of, they're in a really tough situation. The life and circumstances that they have kind of co-created, right?
Yes,
That's
the
not
web that they are stuck in. Yes.
exactly. Um, you know, it's not as simple as, oh, these thoughts are good, I'll keep them. These thoughts are not good, let's get rid of them. Because then it's like, well, if I start following my more authentic self, actually, maybe if you can talk to us about this so I don't dominate this whole conversation, but talk to us about like when someone starts being more authentic, like what are some of the challenges that they will tend to face, whether if it's with their family or their loved ones, maybe even at work?
Yeah. I mean, I would say even before that, I think even for themselves, right? Like, because I think the challenges one themselves and also their external environment
Yeah.
is I think that's where self-compassion comes into play because
Mm,
once you start noticing what your thoughts are, one of the challenges is oh no, that's me being mean to myself again. Like, damn it, Colette, why are you doing this again? And then you're hard on yourself for the fact that you
wait,
are
that's so
having
true.
feelings. So
That's
I
so
think
true. Yeah.
one of the first things is honoring what those feelings are, right? Like even if you have expectations that you've realized don't, I won't even say high expectations, but that you realize don't
Sure.
serve you,
Yeah.
it's honoring that. Like it's okay that you have this expectation. There's nothing wrong with the fact that like this is what you wanted for yourself and it's okay to grieve
Hmm.
that this is a thing you wanted that isn't working. So
Mm,
like it's completely okay to be disappointed. It's okay that you haven't reached what you've wanted to reach.
hmm.
Um so I think the first step is just like having compassion for like that is okay. Like every
Yeah.
negative feeling doesn't equal that you messed up. And I think that's where the
Yeah.
happiness comes in. It's like I think to people, happiness means I did it right. Or it's
Hmm.
like, again, for a perfectionist, it's like, oh, that's how I know things are good. Like, that's how I know I'm doing things right. And
Hmm.
like sometimes it's like it's a thing. It's an emotion like any other, and the other ones are okay too. It doesn't mean that you
Yeah.
failed or you're doing something wrong because
Yeah,
those other ones are coming in.
totally. What exactly is self-compassion for those that hear this word and don't quite understand it or maybe have
Yeah.
a misguided idea of what it is?
Sure. It's having kindness for yourself through all life circumstances, right? So through mistakes, through mishaps, through even if you do something wrong, not even if it's a mistake, even if you do something that like overtly is harmful,
Yeah.
um, that you have compassion for yourself as
Mm-hmm.
though you would have had it for somebody else.
Hmm. Yeah.
Sometimes it helps people to like step back and say, like, if this was happening with somebody else, what would I tell them? If this was happening with a friend,
Yeah.
how would I counsel them on this? Because very often, not all the time, there are also people who are tough on other people, but often it is we react to ourselves so much more critically than we
Yeah.
would somebody close to us.
Yeah. Yeah. And so sometimes like externalizing it makes it a little bit easier to, I guess, even practice the idea of compassion and at least understand it. And then the hope is that you can replicate it for yourself. But yeah, it definitely is a practice. It's a very challenging thing to do. I think in general,
Mhm.
like even people that aren't perfectionists, I see struggle with that. But then obviously,
Yeah.
especially people that are perfectionist or yeah, have like really high, either have their own high expectations or high expectations have been placed on them in some sort of way.
Yeah. And I think I want to get back to what you said because you
Yeah.
originally asked
Yeah.
the environment,
Oh,
right?
right. Yeah.
What you
Yeah.
do when
Yeah.
there's somebody you're in a relationship with, your friends, your family who are kind of pushing back on, who they know you to be. If you are
Yeah.
somebody who is always there 100% of the time and never says no, like it is possible that there might be some resistance to that.
Hmm.
Um, and this is something I say all the time, like you can't control other people's reactions to you. Like all you could do is in your communication, be as thoughtful as possible and try to be as clear as possible in the way
Yeah.
that you can be. And you cannot control how somebody receives that and wants to react back to it.
Mm.
Because I think very often people are looking to control other people's reactions. That's where all the overthinking comes in. Like, if I say this, how are they going to react? How do I
Yes.
say this correctly? And
Yes.
and sometimes you can say it to the best of your ability,
Right.
and it's on them to be able to accept whatever boundary, whatever communication you've set forth.
Yeah. I love that you answered my question starting with the self-compassion for yourself because it really does take so much of your own groundedness
Mhm.
in order to then deal with or just manage the people around you that are going to struggle. Rightly so. They're used
Yeah,
to a version of you. In some ways, your over generosity with them is very comfortable and convenient for
yeah,
them in some sort of ways. And so now that you're kind of taking that away, they're going to get upset. And so hopefully their upset isn't gigantic and vindictive. Hopefully it's
right.
small, but sometimes it is. And so if the reaction is big, you do need you do need to feel confident in the decision that you're making in setting that boundary so that you don't fall apart. I mean, even if you
Hmm.
do, whatever, that's what continuous therapy and support is
Yeah,
for. There were many times where my therapist was like, okay, Francesca, this is what you're gonna go say. And then I'd go say it, and I was like, we got into an argument, like,
right.
like,
And thinking that you messed it up.
thinking that I messed it up.
Yeah,
Exactly. Thinking that I messed it up because, like you said earlier, we're trying to control other people's
yeah.
reactions to us. And so then it's like we believe that we have enough power to not only set the boundary, but also make sure the person's okay with the boundary, make sure they
Mhm.
still like us, make sure we're still in a relationship with them. And yeah, that's completely out of our control. which is scary, but also kind of helps take the blame off you if things
Hmm.
don't go well.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's kind of the key. Like I think we
Yeah.
feel so overly responsible
Yeah.
for the way that other people react or act. And again, we have our own accountability. Like we can't go in
Sure,
acting
yeah.
nuts, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. No, I
that's a
love
part
that
of
you
it.
said,
But
yeah.
what's funny is I think for perfectionists, that's not a huge problem. Like they're always calculating and thinking. Like if there was another population of people I was working with, I would maybe speak about this differently.
Sure.
But at least for the people that I tend to see,
Yeah.
it's they're overly critical. They're overly thinking about how their actions are impacting other people. It's so tangled up in themselves and their own self-worth and how much other people will like them that for the people I work with, I'm not concerned that like they're gonna then swing the other direction and like
Right.
caring about people altogether and that like that's
No.
gonna be a problem. Like they're
No.
that already is a foundational thing for them that's important to them. And that's also
Right.
okay.
Right. Right. You're not having like deep discussions about like what accountability looks like and
Right, yes.
the-
And
they're
again, for
already
some
like,
other people, that's an important conversation.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I love though that you said, you use the word thoughtful in how you can maybe communicate those boundaries. Because in a sense, you do want to be respectful in your delivery of them as much as you can.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, sometimes you just need to set your boundaries and like hope and pray that the person is gonna figure out how to deal with it.
Right. And again, like you say, hope and pray. There's literally nothing else that you have. Like you can't, that really is once you say it, that's where you leave it. And I also
Yeah.
say too, like, and again, there's other situations where maybe there's like a really outrageous reaction and maybe something is
Sure.
unfixable. But very often, like we have the opportunity to go back and try to explain or expand upon, or if really necessary. Like sometimes that's
Yeah.
not necessary, and that's you like wishing you got the reaction again. But
Yeah.
very often, like there isn't a mistake that's unfixable.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you can always circle back. I know even in sessions, like there's times where I've said something or had a conversation with a client and I've like thought on it and I will come back the next time and be like, you know what, I was just thinking on it. Like, how did that land for you? Because
Yeah.
I was thinking about it. And sometimes it's fine and sometimes they're like, yeah, I was thinking and that was hurtful or that's not where I was at or and so it is okay. I think even in what
Mhm.
we do, like it's okay
Yeah.
if we make a mistake and can come back to it and circle back.
Yeah. I think it's beautiful that you also role model that for your clients to kind of give them an idea of like how they could then do it in their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people struggle with that is that sometimes maybe like as coaches or therapists, we hand them a concept, right? But then
Yeah.
it's like, okay, how do you actually go implement this? Like, what are the
Yeah.
words that you're supposed to say or the attitude that you're supposed to have in that situation? And I like the way you showed it because you're still very grounded in yourself. Like you're not freaking out about the other person. You're
Mm-hmm.
just opening a space for a dialogue so that there isn't any like misunderstanding or, assumption that there was any malicious ill will behind like what
Right.
happened.
And by the way, most of the time they're like, no, I was fine. It was
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. It's funny when you start learning how to like when you're able to because right, so like if perfectionism is often rooted in shame, when you're able to have enough self-compassion for yourself to let go of some of that shame and then use that momentum to then like go talk to someone and be like, hey, there's this thing that I said. I feel like it was rude or
Mhm.
disrespectful. I'm sorry. And it's like you spend like 2 weeks overthinking it. You don't sleep
Yeah.
well at night because of it. And then you talk to the person and they're like, I don't even remember when that happened.
Right.
And you're like, oh my God, I just spent like
All
two
that
weeks
time spent.
all that time spent. And it's frustrating, but it's cool because then you're like, wow, I really should learn to relax a little bit. Like
Right.
not
It helps bring
everyone
perspective, I think,
perspective.
back
Yeah,
to, yeah.
100%. What are some? self-compassion practices. I don't want to use the word strategies, but like, kind of that people can maybe start implementing listening to us today?
I mean, again, I would say the first one is just to pay attention
Mm,
to the things that you say to yourself. I know I'll have some clients, and it depends on the client, but I'll have some clients like write it down and say, like, when you notice you're harsh to yourself, like maybe have a note in your phone, just to like write down what it was and just
yeah.
reassess, because like
Yeah.
so often, like we're not in, like, I'm not in the business of trying to like control what your thoughts are. Like thoughts are just things that happen,
Yeah.
like, and sometimes it's like it doesn't even feel like it's you. It's just this like intrusive thing that popped up. I think when people say intrusive thoughts, they think like OCD, or they think like I'm gonna harm myself, I might hurt someone else. It can literally be as simple as like I'm stupid. Like that can be an intrusive thought.
Yeah.
So I think just noticing what those patterns of thought are that are impacting how you're feeling about yourself internally,
Hmm.
um, is a really good first step. Because I think very often people are like, oh my gosh, Colette, it's all the time. Like I'm saying negative stuff to myself all the time. And sometimes you look back
Yeah.
and you believe it. And sometimes you're like, oh, that I didn't need to think that or believe that in that
Right.
moment.
Right.
So I think the first thing would be that is taking inventory of what those thoughts are, and just
Hmm.
even assessing if you think they're true in the first place. Um, but I would say another thing is I think perfectionism and anxiety too, because I think it's grounded in anxiety, but is really lack
Yeah.
of grounding. Like you said, like it's so in your head, it's so
Yeah.
cognitive. Um, that I think just learning those skills, whether it's meditation, whether it's prayer, whether it's just laying somewhere and breathing, whether it's
Yeah.
being outside in nature, is just like being aware of how you're feeling
Hmm.
and allowing for those emotions to come up, your feelings to come up without the judgment.
Right. Right. And then maybe letting those like full circle back to our initial conversation, like letting those guide you in your
Mm-hmm.
decisions. Um, Often when we think of I got more into like spirituality and manifesting and alignment and all these things. And at the beginning I was like, what? I don't understand how to, because I was very cognitive, right? So I didn't
Yes.
understand how do you then make the decision if you can't calculate it mathematically, like you
Yes.
explained earlier. I was like, I don't understand. That's how I'm used to making my decisions.
Right.
Especially big life decisions, right? Because,
Yes.
it's challenging. If it's just like, what am I going to eat today? That's already challenging on its own. But if it's
Yes, it
like
is.
big life decisions, how do we make those when we're so used to trying to figure out, like you said, what's right in our head?
Hmm.
And I love what you're saying of like it sounds like the transition that you help people through is really like, okay, how do you get from your head to like into your body and then let the responses that your body is sending you guide you in your decision making process, kind of like you did with your career, it sounds like.
Right. And I think so often we ignore it, right? Like we might have feelings in our body and we maybe ignore it because it's like, oh, well, this will get me more money, or this is
Yeah.
what my parents want me to do, or this seems like a better long-term decision. And listen, there's a lot of factors, right? Like I'm sure
Yeah.
working with people in that, like
Yeah.
in finding a career, there's a
Yeah.
lot of things that do come into play,
Yeah.
that I don't want to ignore. And that has to
Yeah.
do with like perfectionism too, right? Like sometimes you live with your family that has expectations of you, and
Yeah.
it's not easy to just pretend that it doesn't matter, you know?
Right. Right. Right.
Like
Right. Yeah.
it does. It probably really does. And so I
Yeah.
think to again just have compassion for the situation that you're in,
Yeah,
and
like the
being able to
context of
take those
things.
steps, because
Yeah.
there are certain external factors you cannot change.
Right.
And so I think to really just take the steps from where you are at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes so much sense. That makes a lot of sense. Especially I'm thinking like whether you come from certain cultural backgrounds or whether if you're like at the intersection of like if you're like in the LGBTQ community,
Mhm.
and then maybe you also are, um, you're also from a minority group, and you also maybe grew
Yeah.
up in like a challenging, financial situation. It's just like, hey, let's just take like the burden off of you, and
Yeah.
and the fact that you think that it's your fault that you haven't reached certain things, and like just acknowledge like, and I'm just using that as an example, right? Like not
Mhm.
everyone that is in those situations, not it's not limiting for everybody, but it
Sure.
can be for most people that I know that are in those
Yeah.
situations. And so it's just like, okay, sweetie, like it's not your fault that you aren't where you want to be. Like
Yes.
there are real circumstances and situations around
Yeah.
you. Or I think of like one woman that I worked with that she was divorcing her abusive husband, and she also had like three jobs to help her kind
Yeah.
of do that, and her expectations were so high of herself, and I'm like, sweetie, you can't like divorce your abusive husband, emotionally recover from that, have three
Right.
jobs, and also think that you're gonna
Look.
be on top of ironing, cooking, laundry. Like no, like
Yes.
one of these has got to go, and it's okay if you're not going to do it perfectly all the time.
Mhm. And that's what I say very often is like the goal, there tends to be so many, right? Like
Yeah,
there's so many goals. And so like when people come in, that's another hallmark I notice is like this is wrong, that's wrong, this is wrong, everything's wrong. I don't, and you feel so overburdened and overwhelmed and you don't even know where
yeah,
to start because like you said, like
yeah,
they've participated in like this web that has been weaved around their perfectionism or the way that they interact with other people.
right,
And so it is like, okay, this is everything that you said to me is like this
yeah,
and this and this and this. Where do you want to start? Like what either what feels like the biggest burden to you that you'd like to work on or
yeah,
what feels like the easiest thing to try
right,
to get to
right,
in this moment? Because you're right.
yeah,
Like I'm not often telling people in sessions to do 45 different things at the same time. Like it is like, okay, what is, and again, it's that alignment of like
yeah,
what where feels good to start for you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And also what feels manageable to even
Hmm.
start
Yeah.
changing or shifting about your life in a way that like at least you can handle it.
Right. Isn't overwhelming.
Exactly.
Because God knows they're already overwhelmed.
Exactly. I will say though, usually similar to you, ask my client, where would you like to start? But many of my clients are Italian, just by the nature of the work that I do. And a lot of them are women and a lot of them are moms. And I don't know if you know this, but in Italian culture, people iron like everything. Like when I say everything, I mean everything, like underwear, socks,
Hmm.
sheets, like everything. And I am on a personal mission to get Italian moms to stop ironing everything. And it's funny we're having this conversation because one of my clients that a year ago I told her, I was like, you do what? With what time? You have a
Yeah.
4-year-old. Like, no. I was like, please, no more ironing. Like, unless you have to, because I understand you
Right.
want to look appropriate when you go to work.
Hmm.
But like your husband can iron his own shirts. Your daughter, you're not ironing her little t-shirts that are going to be dirty and mud
Yeah.
2 seconds later. And this morning she told me that she actually stopped ironing, and I was like, we have won.
Yes. But that's exactly what I mean, right? Like it's
Yeah,
tuning into like what are those things that are
yeah,
burdening you? What does your life look like? Like and what can you take a look with like look at and can go, you know? And
yeah,
I'm sure
yeah.
there's a value attached to needing to iron everything. I'm sure there and like you said,
Sure.
cultural,
It's
I'm sure it is
cultural.
important to her.
It's super cultural. It's a
Yeah.
society that very much likes to it's a lot about appearances and how you
Hmm.
present yourself, and for women specifically, it's a lot about like how do you keep a home, and are you doing a good
Yeah.
job at keeping a home, and are you doing a good job at, it's very much like the woman's responsibility to make sure that everyone in her family like looks a certain
Your
way.
worth is attached to
Your
what
worth is
everything looks
attached to it.
like. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And obviously this is very present in other cultures. I'm just speaking
Hmm.
to Italian culture right now, but yeah, like it's like what you were saying of just like, okay, let's go look at the family expectations, the societal expectations, the cultural expectations, the gender expectations. Like, okay, which one of these do we want to keep? Which
Yeah.
one of them can go?
And also, like we're saying, like it's not, and I know we're laughing about it, and it is
Yeah.
funny, but that it's
Yeah.
not, it doesn't mean that it's silly. It doesn't mean that
No,
it's
no, no.
stupid. It doesn't
No, no,
mean that
no.
there's something inherently wrong with it. It means that when you take a look at things, it's not working for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes a big difference when you're able to really like just acknowledge that
Hmm.
and be honest with yourself about that.
Yeah. And that there can be humor in it too, like that you can find
Yeah.
humor in being like, I was ironing underwear, like that. It's
Yeah.
okay. Like, I think, and we also take ourselves so seriously. And I think in
Yeah.
sessions, like, we laugh a lot at like
Yeah.
things that are going on and like what's happening in their world. And that, like, oh my God, I did this thing and it was so funny. Like, I know I have somebody who gets massively overwhelmed with laundry.
Hmm.
Um, and it is that it's like building it up in your head, like I have to do this whole thing and then I have to put it in and then I have to wait and then it has to come out and then I have to put it in the dryer and then I have to fold
Yeah.
it. And it feels so overwhelming in your head,
Yeah.
which by the way, folding laundry, I hate. Like I'm with you. I get it. But that like it doesn't have to consume so much space. Like, do you have to do
Right.
it every day? Like what are the barriers to make it, like what is making it feel so overwhelming? What are the barriers for you?
Right.
And like, okay, maybe there's a different way you could do it. Maybe you do it once a week. Maybe you do it a few times a week so it's not as much. It's just and
Yeah.
it's different for everyone. Like there's no right
Yeah.
way for so
Yeah.
much of this.
No, that's so true. It's like when you can, because also too, it's like that way, it's like if you're not aware of your way of thinking, you're also not realizing how your way of thinking is like
Mhm.
creating these extra problems for yourself.
Yes. And I
And
think
that's what you can
often
control.
perfectionism
Yeah.
like turns into procrastination. Like you said, like
Yeah.
you weren't necessarily like having crazy expectations for yourself, but like
Yeah.
thinking of all these things and the way that you have to do it and want to
Hmm.
do it and just reassessing like, is it necessary? Like, and maybe
Yeah.
it is, but
Yeah.
it might not be.
Yeah. It's interesting to see people. I think it's not interesting. I think it's really beautiful to see people that are perfectionists when they're in that state of like I used to work with a lot of kids and teens that had like mental health issues. And you would meet all these kids and their parents would be like, oh, they don't do this and they don't do that and they didn't do that more of this and whatever. And then you get to know the kid and you realize they're not just like lazy and like dumb and
Mhm.
whatever. It's like they're bogged down by this perfectionism, by like the executive functioning overload of
Mhm.
how do I do this thing? How do I do it so that my parents are happy about it? My parents aren't going to be happy about it anyway because they're always going to figure out what's
Right.
wrong about it anyway. So like, what the fuck is the point anyway? And then yeah, and then they look like they're just like sitting on the couch or
Mhm.
playing video games, but their head is like nonstop going, going,
Yeah.
going, like anxious, critical, whatnot.
And like you're right. I think it's tuning into why is that hard for you? Like
Yeah,
what makes it hard for you? What, like you said, even with like the ironing, like
yeah,
what makes you feel like that's so important to you? What makes it feel like this is taking up so much time? Why are you like what makes you feel attached to that? Like
yeah,
what is the barrier? Like what are creating barriers for you, like you said, for kids and like getting things done? Because sometimes people
right.
can be overly critical and just be like, you're not doing this and you're not doing this and you're not doing this. And I just personally, I don't even believe the word lazy. Like I don't believe that it's a
Yeah,
thing. Like I think there's
yeah,
always something else under it, whether it's perfectionism or whether it's ADHD or whether it's
yeah.
anxiety. And it doesn't have to be anything diagnosable. It's just like
Sure, yeah.
there is something inherent getting in the way.
Yes,
And I think very
yes,
often it could be very critical of like, oh, you're just not doing this. When I think what's important and what I'm trying to get to is like, what is that barrier for you? And looking at it with like curiosity and understanding
right.
and not an air of criticism, like really just being
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah. And I would imagine a lot of people that work with you, because even the questions that you're asking, I'm like, oh, that sounds like so compassionate, in the way that you're asking them. I might imagine that they're able to then kind of, maybe with enough time, are able to ask themselves those types of questions, like with themselves, whether it's through journaling or even their own self-reflection, so that they can kind of just explore what's
Mhm.
happening inside and like whether it's serving them or not.
Right. And I think it's important because you don't know, like you're allowed to be disappointed in yourself that like something isn't working, like it
Yeah,
can be very frustrating. As business owners, we know it can
we
be
know.
frustrating, incredibly. But there is a difference between being like, you know what, I don't think this is working, and like looking at it like with curiosity, and
Yeah.
between seeing it as I'm messing up, I'm not doing this right. what is wrong with me? Like there's
Yeah.
just there's a difference, and it sounds silly and it sounds like it's a little difference, but it's not. Like being
No,
able to
it's hugely
passion
significative.
is a big difference.
Yeah. 100%. It's hugely significative. It makes a huge difference between like, because also too, in a sense, and this is kind of how I started to think about it recently, work, business, whatnot, but it's like when you are so hyper focused on blaming yourself, you might actually miss something of
Mhm.
like something that actually should get changed, something that could actually be improved, but it's like you're so hyper focused on just like where did I go wrong and where did I mess this up?
Yeah. And I think very often, like when you do things that feel aligned with you and what you want, like that's what brings you closer to what feels good. Like you might not know in the moment, like you might not know exactly what's right for you, but what does feel good? Is it taking a workout class? Is it just sitting by yourself and meditating? Is it taking a walk? And I think very often those things bring you closer to whatever you're looking for, whatever the answer is. Because I know for me, like I said, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, I could never have planned that a random man in the advisory department of my school was going to randomly say, "Oh, by the way," like I couldn't
Yeah.
have planned for that. But I think as a perfectionist, like we try to plan. I like we try to like make things happen, but like you never know when you're around people who align with you, like what that just kind of brings you to. And so some things like you wouldn't be able to plan.
Yeah. Yes. And it really does become so, I'm just like, maybe there's probably other conversations I'll have that I won't insert myself as much in the conversation, but I relate to this so deeply as a recovering perfectionist because we're so scared of losing control
Mhm.
of a situation. We're so scared of it going wrong or not as we planned that, and that's where spirituality really helped me, like having a connection with something greater, more powerful than myself, that I could be like, you know what? I don't freaking know. You figure it out because I am at my wit's end. Because life also becomes so much more beautiful when you're not obsessed with controlling every detail, and then you actually get like surprised, and
Yeah,
it's like a surprise birthday party where you're like, "Oh my God, this is the most beautiful
this
thing."
was
And
it.
this is exactly what I wanted. I wouldn't have even known to plan it. And it means so much because you then get to just like receive that instead of
Yes.
being in like forcing everything energy.
And when you force it, I think you can also miss things, right? Like I think you
Yeah.
can miss parts of your life that are so beautiful that you are
Yeah.
just missing because you keep changing your goalpost or you haven't reached the thing. But like within that, the journey, there's pieces of it that are really beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Even like messing up and figuring it out and then getting better at figuring it out. And then you're like, wow, look at me. Look at where we were, where we are now. How cool is that?
Right.
Oh my gosh, I could keep chatting with you for forever. I might have to invite you on again so that we don't keep everyone listening to us for too long.
I would love to.
But this just really, I really appreciate this deeply resonates with me. Perfectionism is something that so many people I think are suffering with, and they don't even fully understand how much they're struggling with it. And they don't understand really like the massive toll it can be taking on their life. So I think this is super beneficial. Thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna put all your details in the show notes, but if you want to like briefly tell us where people can find you, everyone who's
Sure.
listening.
So my website is ColetteJonesLCSW.com, and Colette with two Collettee. And my Instagram too. I have a lot over there. At Collette Jones underscore LCSW.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Colette, for being here. And thank you for letting me share all my ideas and brainstorms about this all. But I really appreciate also like your emphasis on self-compassion. And I hope that's what people really take away from this conversation. That was a literally life savior, was learning how to practice that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.